How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the More We Know podcast. I am your host, Mir, and the More We Know podcast is a mentorship podcast launched for Gen Zs and millennials looking for inspiration and to find real-life mentors in their pocket via Apple, Spotify, wherever you go. We've had experts from all around the world join our show, like the mayor of Miami, the founder of Reebok, and today I am so privileged with the guest that we have. We are changing the direction a bit, and this man is extremely intelligent. He is a thought leader in the space, and I am so grateful and honored to even have the next hour with him as our mentor of the month. So we have Professor or Dr. John List, who is a leading American economist at the University of Chicago, where he serves as the Kenneth C. Griffin Distinguished Service Professor, and he was also from 2012 to 2018 the chairman of the Department of Economics. He previously had phenomenal roles as Chief Economist at Uber, and then he went on to become Chief Economist at Lyft. He now has an amazing role as the Chief Economist at Walmart, which is phenomenal. And on top of that, he recently launched his book, The Voltage Effect, which I have personally read. I'm a big fan of. I'm excited to dive into a little bit more about the book today. And it's already become a bestseller. It's made the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, USA Today, Washington Post, LA Times bestsellers list. The resume speaks for itself. I could sit here for 10 minutes and speak about you, John, but I need to introduce you. So thanks for coming on today.
Oh, gosh. Look, I'm a big fan of yours, big fan of the show. I've been waiting for my invitation. So I love that I finally get a shot to step up. And, I love that you're being a mentor and you're thinking about changing the world through helping others, because that's exactly one key piece of leadership. So I really appreciate your leadership, and thanks so much for having me.
Doctor, those words from you mean so much. It's exactly why The More We Know was launched. It was launched during COVID when people were losing jobs and Gen Zs had no idea what to do next. And as you know, the economy was in shambles. And so I was looking for a way to provide mentorship and give people value. And this was one of the best ways to provide real life mentorship through interviews from experts like yourself. So without further ado, I do want to get right into it. You are a very accomplished and seasoned economist, but who was John as a child? Like, walk us back through your actual childhood and growing up and what led you to where you're at now.
Yeah, wow. Great question. So John as a child was a kid who loved to play sports. And he would play any sport that was put in front of him: basketball, baseball, football, golf, et cetera, et cetera. John was a kid who was raised in a great family, but a family that maybe didn't value education as much as what John's colleagues' parents did when they were kids. As an example, I don't remember having a book in our house until the 5th grade. And in the 5th grade, it was life-changing for me because there was a traveling encyclopedia salesman who came by, and my dad decided to buy the A through Z. And I dug in, of course, and I got to know M really well. I knew everything in the M category of the encyclopedia, then N. Really loving household. We made do with, my father was a truck driver, my grandpa was a truck driver, my mom was a secretary. So ton of love, ton of support. And when it came time to go to college, they were a little skeptical about whether I should go to college, but I convinced them. And with a partial golf scholarship, I ended up going to University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point. Without the golf scholarship, I wouldn't have gone to college, because that was the key way that I could convince my parents that college made sense. But then I found out quickly within 2 or 3 months that I would never be good enough to make any money playing golf. So I had to pivot, and I had to quit on that dream and start a new dream. And that was to become an economist.
What an amazing journey. And pivoting is something we'll get into in the business world and how important that is to do. Yeah. But what a mission. I mean, even going into the world of teaching, I would say, would you agree that the world of teaching isn't necessarily glamorized in the sense of income like an investment banker is or an executive at a company, correct?
Oh, 100%. So I received my PhD from the University of Wyoming in 1996, and I was top of my class. I was advertised as the best thing since sliced bread. And my first job was at the University of Central Florida, and I was earning $48,000 per year. And then if I taught extra in the summer, an extra set of courses, I could then earn $64,000 total. And as you can imagine, maybe my peers and people who were getting undergrad degrees and going right to, at the time, Smith Barney, or working for investment banks or other types of firms and industries, they were making probably 10x that. You don't get into education for money, clearly don't. You get in because you want to change the world through education and through teaching and through research. So it's a great life, but you should not do it if you want to make money.
Well, I love that. And, sometimes you're able to mix your passion within that and find ways, launching different things. But that's 100% true. I appreciate you sharing that. Now, to get to where you got to, you were in Wyoming. How did you end up coming to Chicago and serving here?
Yeah, gosh, that was a long road. So I started my career as an assistant professor at the University of Central Florida, and I was there for 4 years. And a little known fact is I also coached for 2 years the men's and women's water ski teams at the University of Central Florida. Yeah, that's a little known fact. We were good. We competed for national championships. We were really good. We had scholarship athletes on both the male and female side. After 4 years at Central Florida, I moved to the University of Arizona, and I was only there for a short time. And then I moved as a professor to the University of Maryland, and I was a pretty young professor. So I went up the ranks reasonably quickly. When I was at the University of Maryland, I took a year and a half off to work in the White House. So I was an advisor to President Bush. I worked at the Council of Economic Advisors. I was a senior economist giving President Bush advice on various aspects associated with environmental economics, climate change, trade negotiations, etc. And then in 2005, I was lucky enough to secure an opportunity to come and join the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. And that's where I've been for the last 17 years.
How does that work, Doctor? Does that work in a similar fashion into the corporate world where other companies see your work and recruit you? Did you have to apply?
No, that's right. So early on, you apply. What I learned is that when you're young, if you have to apply, you're not going to get the job. So in the end, you need people to come after you. So what happened, for example, in 2004 was my field experiments began to become a hit. And people realized that field experiments are going to be the future of economics. And at that point, a lot of schools reached out to me. So I think I had 9 or 10 job offers from all around America in 2004. But in the end, I was convinced that University of Chicago was for me just because around campus, you have brilliant people, but also around every corner, you have somebody talking about economics and how they can use economics to change the world. So that's when I knew that University of Chicago was my home.
That's amazing. And I think that's a valuable lesson for people, especially as you go through your career, whether professor or work or starting your own business, you want to eventually be sought after. I remember even with the podcast, the first few episodes, it was a lot of just outreach, no downloads, no numbers. So why do you want to be on my show? So you had to sell yourself. Yeah. And now it's to a point where, I have guests coming in left and right where they're internally reaching out inbound. So it's awesome to hear that. Now you mentioned the word, you said field experience. A lot of our audience is in their early 20s and don't even know what the word micro means or macro. So what is the field experiment? And
yeah, exactly. Let's talk about that. I want your listeners to think about John List as using the world as his lab. So I want them to think, have they taken an Uber or Lyft in the past 7 years? No doubt. Have they flown United Airlines? Have they voted in presidential elections? Have they used Google or Facebook? If they've done any of these things, it's likely that they have been a subject in one of my experiments. So I go to the world and I use it as my lab and I try to learn about, does economics do a good job of explaining your behavior? So for example, if you're sitting in downtown Chicago, I might give you a high or a low price or a high or a low ETA. What that means is it might take a while for the car to come and pick you up. When I vary those prices in those times, I learn how sensitive you are to price changes. So I learn about your demand curve. And I also learn about how sensitive you are to time changes. So for example, how important is time to you? Now that's important to Uber and Lyft as a company because if time is super important, they might want to dispatch in a different way, or they might want to develop new products like Wait and Save or Walk and Save. Those are products that came up from some of our research at Lyft because we learned about what do people desire through these field experiments.
That's remarkable and extremely interesting. So, when we look at these apps on the back end, I remember when Uber first launched, it was sold as the soccer mom driver, right? Anyone could drive you. And, there was a lot of fear, and the taxi industry quickly brushed it off because, they don't want to look at change. And it didn't make sense. If you didn't have a medallion or a professional driver, why should I trust you effectively to be my driver? But it sounds like the way a lot of these companies grow is through experiments and using economics like what you're doing. Is that fair to say?
That's a fantastic question. So when I first walked into Uber, there was a sign that said, data is our DNA. And in a lot of companies, they have slogans and they're just slogans that the companies don't live by what they say. But at Uber, they did. So every time you had an opportunity to gather data that were informative, you did it. And the exact same thing happened at Lyft. Every moment you're thinking about a new product or a new service, you do it as a pilot, but make sure that you can do it to learn in terms of, will that new product work? Test bed it and hold some people back and put some people in treatment. I want you to think a lot like a medical trial. We cannot figure out if medicines work unless some people get the pill and other people get a placebo or they stay in control. The best firms that I work with today are constantly looking for an edge, constantly looking for an advantage, and they're using the experimental method to generate new data to give themselves an edge. Look, that's why I'm going to Walmart. When Walmart reached out to me and said, we heard you're doing great things at Lyft. We would love it if you would come and help us. I said, well, are you open to data science? Are you open to generating new data using field experiments? They said yes and yes. And I said, I'm in, because that means you want to change the world through data. And that also means that you're not an endangered species. What I mean by endangered species, organizations, whether they're for-profit firms or nonprofit firms, the ones who aren't using data and aren't using the experimental method, they're endangered. And in the future, they're going to get trampled because there will be another person who is as good at what you're doing as you are, but they're going to add data and learn about what are the best ways to do things. And you are not only threatened, you are then endangered, and you will be extinct very soon.
And John, we've seen that over and over again with different companies that haven't adapted, like BlackBerry and, Kmart. Kmart actually, it's funny you're speaking of Walmart. I thought Kmart had a competitive edge over Walmart initially from a funding and actual amount of stores perspective. Walmart was significantly smaller at the time, and look where Kmart is and look where Walmart is.
That's right.
So
that's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point. Think of Blockbuster. They're just a trail of firms who have been left by the wayside. Studebaker, Detroit Steel, American Sugar. When you look at the Fortune 500 companies from, say, 50 years ago, there are many, many that are not in existence today. And that happens there. And that's a healthy and vibrant marketplace for ideas and innovation. You have to use data today to keep up.
Yeah, I love that. And I hope people are listening to that, because data is the future, and it's how you are able to analyze, right? So you do that with your field experience. So what does it mean because you were chief economist Uber, then Lyft, and now chief economist at Walmart, which from a market cap perspective, you really moved up. So what does a chief economist do and mean if someone's never heard of that?
Yeah, great question. Chief economists are pretty new in terms of entering these big firms and playing a role in decision making. But the way I want you to think about, okay, what does a chief economist do from day to day? Any particular economic issue that the firm faces is an area where the chief economist can give advice. So let's just think about Walmart. Pricing. Pricing is very important at Walmart, and a chief economist can give insights to pricing. They're starting a Walmart Plus program, which is a membership program that is going to rival Amazon Prime. Okay, well, what do people want in a program like that? What are they willing to pay for? What are they looking for out of that product or service? Those are things that an economist can help answer. How to set up a membership or rewards program. In the end of the day, every firm not only has to attract new clients or new customers, but they also have to retain them. And I talk a lot about this in chapter 2 of The Voltage Effect, how we can use membership programs to retain clients and make them loyal. That should be rule number 1 is after I get you to try my good or service, do you stick around? And what are the best ways that I can set up for you to want to stick around? So at Uber and Lyft, we talked about driver and rider incentives. What are the best ways to keep them loyal to the program? And you can talk about autonomous vehicles. What are the economics of autonomous and where should our firm be going? Look, in the end, life is economics and economics is life. So when you say, what does a chief economist do in a firm? Pretty much everything, and gives advice about everything because economics is everywhere in a firm.
Now, 100%, is a chief economist, is it a full-time job? Is it on top of being a professor?
Yeah. So the way it works is that because I'm full-time at the University of Chicago, I can only give 1 day a week. So what I do is I set up a team of people, and that team is listening to what I want. Right now, we're a team of about 10 people, but I suspect we're going to keep growing. As we add value to the firm, we will grow. And then that team is carrying out my vision about how we can change the world through Walmart.
That's amazing. And I want to dive a little bit more into Walmart if we will. But one question. Sure. So when you look at Uber and Lyft and you speak about, because one of the biggest challenges is it's tough to acquire customers, but 2, it is equally as tough to keep and retain those customers, to your point. And that's why we've seen in case studies, Costco has done so well with their membership program. But with Uber and Lyft, how did you face the task of saying, hey, what effectively stops me as the customer from building a relationship with my Uber driver and then doing it without Uber, and then they don't have to worry about the fees and I don't have to worry about fees, etc.
No, you're exactly right. When you think about the rideshare business, there are a few major obstacles or impediments that the industry still faces. One of them is when a car pulls up, it might have an Uber and a Lyft sticker on it. So I like to think about it as, at least with Coke and Pepsi, you have a different can. With Lyft and Uber, you have the same car. So your first goal is you have to compete on something different than price. If you keep competing on price and it's always price competition, that's going to be really hard to make it in the long run in a big way. Now, the other feature is this idea about loyalty and how we can keep people to not just focus on price, but focus on what is Lyft doing for our society or what is Uber doing for our society. And in those cases, we really need to bring more value to this particular value proposition. We need to bring more than just moving an individual from point A to point B. And it needs to be beyond just price and price and price, because an industry or a firm will have a really hard time in the long run delivering profits or a healthy return if you're just competing on price at every turn.
Sure, that's amazing. And we've seen Uber and Lyft try to do that over the last 5 years. Lyft acquired the Divvy bike company we see in Chicago. Uber has the rewards ecosystem, Uber Eats. But why still today, Uber and Lyft, the growth that they've had, how come they're still not profitable companies?
No, it's a good question. When you look at the economics of it, I think if they wanted to be profitable, they could be. And what I mean by that is there's room to increase prices, and they're not doing it in a strategic sense, because they don't want people to leave. They want to build a big base so they can generate economies of scale. So it's a bit tricky when I hear people say, well, they're not profitable. It means that they're not able to make it in the long run. It's just not true. If they want to raise prices, people will stick around because people like the fact. Look, let's talk about the great innovation of Uber and Lyft. What it does is it clears the market using prices. So if the market gets kind of on the short side, then they raise price. And if you're willing to pay a higher price, in the end, you can get a trip. In the olden days, you're probably too young to know this, or your listeners are too young, but what rationed taxi cabs was wait time. So people stood in long lines, and instead of having price ration the trip, it was a wait time. And that ends up being very inefficient. when you start to ration goods using wait time. So the great innovation is still there. Now they just need to figure out with the current economics, how can they become a very profitable business? What I see is unless you go to things like moving food and moving freight and doing complementary items, you're really going to need to wait until autonomous vehicles come. And then at that moment, you have a shot because you don't have a bunch of drivers who are taking 80% of the trip, more or less. And that makes it harder to scale. Now, for me, the drivers should be paid even more. So let me be clear about that. I'm not criticizing drivers at all. They should be making more and more. But I think when we start to add technology and autonomous, there will be drivers who are earning more money, who are able to be complements to the technology that comes on board. Then I think that whole industry has a real shot to really grow.
And Professor, how far do you think we are from autonomous vehicles?
I think of some years. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. And I think you're still going to have safety concerns. You're going to have people worried. And in a lot of markets, autonomous just doesn't make sense because the way that the road systems are set up or the congestion, it just isn't conducive or won't be ever conducive for autonomous. But in some markets, the technology is rapidly evolving. But when you look at who owns the technology, it might be somebody like Waymo or Jaguar. It likely will not be Uber and Lyft. So they're going to have to partner with whoever owns that IP or that technology to make sure that together they can lead to a great rideshare industry.
That's interesting. And it goes to show, just listening to your thoughts live, what actually goes into a problem. It's not as simple as just looking at it, but there's so many factors that go into it. So, interesting. You took the position as chief economist with Walmart in such a interesting time with inflation and supply chain issues. Walk us through a little bit of that, taking that position and dealing with the face of inflation.
Yeah, exactly. What have I just gotten myself into? Yeah, inflation's real. Look, inflation's real. And I've said on Twitter that I don't think this inflation will be transitory. And what I mean by transitory is come and go. And the inflation at its roots ends up starting in the beginning of the supply chain, laborers, commodity prices, so capital and labor, and it ends up going all the way through the system. And at Walmart, I can see that. I can see that live. And it ends up, first of all, telling you how important the job is that the Fed has. So the Federal Reserve has a very important job that they at once have to control inflation, but on the other hand, have to have the financial system is a robust financial system that leads to economic growth. And of course, you raise interest rates, and what happens is that can help curb inflation, but it also, of course, helps to curb economic growth. So you have the Fed who's working very hard. In Amazon's sandbox, it's such a big sandbox that you get a very different view or a very different glimpse of what's happening in the global economy. And something that even when I was at Uber's global, but it's such a small piece of the global economy that you don't get as important of a look is what you get when you're at Walmart. The cod coming from country B, or what is Russian grain doing, and what is the war between Russia and Ukraine doing, and how does this spill over to all of the worldwide markets. Those are real effects. And those effects affect our economy in deep ways. And in the end, when you have $5 gasoline and basic necessities at very, very high prices, these are things that are real, and entrepreneurs need to understand that this is the economy that they're building into. Now, that said, remember, there are always cycles. So I am long-term very optimistic about our economy and the global economy. It's going to be, let's say, a rough ride for the next several months.
And let me ask you about that. So you mentioned the Fed and inflation and rates. It's a lot to unpack there. Where I'm confused about is we just went through a cycle where we kept rates as low as possible.
Oh, yeah,
absolutely. We were printing a ton of money. And now we're in an environment where we're talking about now raising another 75 in the upcoming meeting. Why does the Fed go through this push and pull of cycles where rates are little to none, and then we have to raise them high enough to combat inflation? Like, do we put ourselves in these situations?
I think that market shocks in many cases, and disruptions put us in these situations. When you think about COVID and you think about the war with Russia and Ukraine, these are very important shocks to the system that we need to understand how to control. And we do understand that in a lot better way than we used to. And that's where Fed policy can really help. And in other cases, some people might think, well, look, they held interest rates so low in part because they didn't have to compete against inflation. Inflation was never a problem. But then economic growth became really, really high and the market started to overheat. And then they started to worry about, could inflation be coming? So then they kind of temper growth. I think the Fed in the last 30 or 40 years has done a remarkable job in moderating and steering our economy. It's just that occasionally when you look at the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, you look at the shocks that are happening now, these are real external issues that affect markets. And the Fed seems to be doing a really good job to steer us clear of those icebergs.
Yeah, it's always interesting to hear from an economist perspective because, again, headlines can change things. The Fed is doing this, or even to your point about Uber and Lyft, analysts are so focused on earnings per share, but what you dropped there about the fact that maybe they just don't need to be profitable yet because of X, Y, and Z investments. So I love hearing it from your perspective. It's really educational and important. Now, I want to ask you, you mentioned 2008. For us Gen Zs, our first professional crisis was COVID. So we've never experienced something like an '08 before. When you look at economies of scale and just the macro, what happened in 2008 from your perspective? Like, why was there a crash and what was that experience like going through it?
Yeah, I think that many people were overexposed and the risk that some firms had was not kept in check. And there were not safeguards in the system that led people to take gambles that they should have never been taking. And those gambles in the end did not pay off and went south. And you had a really troubled financial economy that many economists wondered, will the troubles of the financial side end up spilling over to the real economy? And it did. And when it did, that led to trouble for us. But I think President Obama did a nice job back then. I think the Fed did a nice job. And we really did steer clear of some very important impediments in our economy that could have led to really important and long-lasting negative effects. But I think the policymakers back then did a really nice job. And I think so far around COVID, I think everything has been good except for getting the vaccination in people's bodies. And that became a political issue very quickly on both sides now. I'm not blaming either side. It became a political issue, then it became very difficult to convince people that they need a vaccination. And now, I'm of the mind of it's your body, you make your own decision. And I just wish it would have been more about science and using social science to make the world a better place and less about rhetoric in politics on both sides back then.
Sure. I love that. And it's a hot debate now as we see different, laws being placed into act as we speak. Now, you mentioned when you look at '08 and you look at now and you look at COVID, again, my generation, this was so new to them. So when you see stuff like cryptocurrencies down 60-70%, and in some cases some cryptocurrencies went bankrupt completely, and so many Gen Zs, the retail traders if you will, have lost so much money. For those people listening right now, what value can they gain from such a distinguished professor like yourself on how to A, maybe identify bubbles or market cycles, or B, just factors to look for to raise caution? Sort of like, I'm sure in your classes you've taught about the tulips example before. Yeah.
This is hard, right? This is a hard question because when you look at bubbles, even you can make money even if you know it's a bubble, right? You just invest early and before the whole thing pops, you get out. And now that's great stuff, right? You end up making a ton of money in that particular commodity or financial instrument. The problem is it's a bit like a random walk. And what I mean by a random walk is think about a drunk walking out of the bar and stumbling around. You have no clue where that drunk is going to be headed. That's a lot like asset prices in a way, right? There's a famous book called A Random Walk Down Wall Street by Burton Malkiel. And you have to just recognize this is in many cases what these asset prices are doing is they're random walks. So to me, the best advice is I do dabble a little bit, but I never become fully exposed. I think it's the old adage of make sure you're diversified. Make sure that in these super risky investments, you're not investing anything that you will deeply, deeply need in the near future. So I put dollars in there that if they're burned, my course in life isn't going to change. So when I live day to day, I don't want to invest anything in a super risky asset that I know I'm going to need in a few months period. So that's like rule number one. Rule number two is on the other side of the extreme, you have people constantly looking at the asset price. And there's something called loss aversion that many people have. So when they look at a stock price, some days it's up, some days it's down. But when it's down, they get a really deep feeling of resentment. And they say, oh, I hate this. So then what they do is they sell their stock and take on really safe investments and like a harbor of a safe investment. That's too far now. So to those people, my advice is don't look at your account. Only look at it every 6 or 8 months, because the more you look at it, you're going to be in assets that are too safe. And it's because of loss aversion. And I wrote about this some years ago in the New York Times financial page, where I said the best advice I can give you is put money in that you won't need tomorrow, but then ignore it for a while, because you're going to be a lot happier and your returns are going to be a lot greater.
That is amazing advice that I hope people are taking into account. I love that. Do you see any similarities to financial markets and casinos?
Oh, 100%. It's just, I've always thought about stock back in the day when I was your age. I always thought about the stock market is a legal form of gambling. In a way, you go into a casino, sure, the house has an edge. And if you're counting cards and blackjack, maybe you can turn that a little bit. But in the end, you play blackjack or you play craps because those give you the best disadvantage that you can get. Now, in the stock market, I like to hope it's a little bit more fair than that it's always not cooked against you. And what I mean by that is I don't want the spreads to be too large, and I don't want people manipulating prices or insider trading, manipulating a price. If it's a clean game, then at least you have a fighting chance in the long run to make a lot of money. Where in the casino, let's be honest, the only way you have a fair chance is if you play poker and you're smarter than everyone, or you're counting cards playing blackjack. Because every other table game in the long run, just look at the expectations. Every dollar you bet, you're losing like 12 cents in expectations. So that's not a great long run bet.
That's reassuring to hear from your perspective, because so many that I've spoken to that have, they did a study where they saw that most of these pandemic retail traders have wiped out all the gains that they've gained initially. And so it caused a extreme sense of depression within my age group, because they feel that, now I can't invest again. I'm scared to what's going to happen. And almost in a sense, it looks back like 2008. I think 2008, I mean, when you look at even companies like Citi pre-split got down to 50, 60 cents. It almost causes such a shock that makes you never want to invest again. So to hear your perspective is reassuring that, the set it and forget it.
No, and you're right. No, but remember, this has happened a lot. When your listeners are too young to know this, but the .com boom was real. I had a lot of friends, right? That's in the late 90s. So I'm roughly 30 years old. I have a lot of friends who are being taken out back then by the .com boom, because every .com that would come up, it would be like a new crypto, and it would explode, and then people would buy all the way up, and then it just boom. The .com boom became something that wiped out a generation. And over time you learn, and you have to take that as advice, because in the long run, the only way you're truly going to make it on the investment side is if you keep playing the game. Let's be honest. I mean, nobody wants to buy CDs and sit on the sidelines. You got to get back in the game, but hopefully in a much safer and more productive way that makes more sense. But the problem is you don't know what makes sense until after it's realized, right? Bitcoin could be $500,000 a coin, and then everyone's still really happy right now, but it turned left, right, and went down to 20,000 as we're speaking.
Correct. I really like that, and I think much like you learn from a loss that burns you, that's sort of like what you're doing with these field experiments, right? You don't know what's going to happen until after the fact. One more question about inflation before we transition to the voltage effect. Because that was a topic when I posted that I was interviewing you. That kept coming up. A couple things saying, "Oh, he's at Walmart. I'm curious how he's dealing with supply chain. Oh, he's doing this."
Yeah.
But the number one question that came up is about inflation. And a lot of people in my generation, believe it or not, don't even know really what inflation is. So I'm curious, how does inflation actually happen?
Yeah. It's a good point, because I think to really understand how inflation can really take over an economy, you just need to think about, and maybe go to Buenos Aires, go to Argentina. And they're constantly fighting this inflationary war where one day the price of bread is $2 and the next day it's $3. And when you think about what inflation can do to what you can purchase and your trust in the whole economic system, a lot of times when you have a bank run, for example, which we had down in Argentina not too long ago, people lose faith in the currency, and they end up then losing faith in the whole economic system. So those are extreme cases. Those are cases of hyperinflation, where inflation runs rampant. Now, if you come back and look at our episodes of inflation in the United States, what you have is, we're in 6, 9, 10% range right now, which is a big deal if you're being paid paycheck to paycheck, and it's hard for you to put gasoline in your car, or it's hard for you to buy baby formula because the prices have gone up so quickly and your wages haven't kept up. That's the problem now, as we begin to see that wages are growing in a much, much more slow fashion compared to prices. And your standard or quality of living is just being eroded by prices continuing to rise. And then you can't afford a nice apartment, or you can't put a down payment down on a home because now homes are 10x what they used to be. And inflation is pricing you out of goods and services that historically you've been able to enjoy. We've been incredibly lucky in the past several decades because we have not faced really, really big or important inflationary fears. You have to go all the way back to the early 70s, where we had really high rates of inflation that ate away at a lot of our, let's say, economic gains for all classes of our society. So I think the last point about inflation is that we need to understand that in many cases, inflation also hurts different groups in a different way. So low SES or high SES people might be harmed in a different way by inflation. And we always have to keep an eye on that as well.
Sure. That makes total sense. And that was a masterclass in just a few minutes on inflation. So I love that. That's I think the listeners will get a lot of value from that. So you're chief economist at Walmart, and they ask you tomorrow, how do we taper or calm down inflation? What are the methods to actually lower inflation?
Yeah, look, I think what we need to do is it starts with commodity prices, and it starts with an efficient supply chain. And let's be clear now, when it comes to workers' wages, we want to make sure workers are paid fairly and they can earn a wage that they can live on comfortably. So you have to be incredibly efficient at every point on the supply chain, but you also still need to do well by your suppliers and your workers. So there's a tension there, as you can see. But I think as you scale and as you grow and reap economies of scale, of course you can give that back to workers and suppliers and customers in a way that is not truly gouging our purchasing power through inflationary pressure. So I think there are ways, and I think it really happens through scaling and efficiency.
And when you raise rates like what the Fed is doing, does that lower inflation?
It should curb inflation. That's right, because it curbs economic growth and it curbs demand.
Okay, that makes sense. Appreciate that. Now let's dive into the voltage effect, because this is a book you wrote in the last year, and it's become quickly a very popular bestseller. It tackles this interesting idea of, because there are a lot of great ideas. I'm sure you come up with great ideas all the time. We all have great ideas. It tackles this idea of why some great ideas make it and why many of them simply don't. What was the inspiration behind the book? Why'd you write it?
So I started a pre-K school in Chicago Heights, which is a suburb just south of Chicago. And the pre-K school was meant to help 3, 4, and 5-year-olds in Chicago Heights. And the pre-K was just killing it. And what I mean by that is we were moving kids in their standardized test scores from the 20th percentile to the 50th percentile within 6 months. And I was super proud of it. So I started to talk to policymakers, telling them that I wanted to scale my program. And they started telling me that, your program won't scale. It looked great in the Petri dish, but don't expect the greatness to hold at scale. I had never really been criticized in that way, but then I started to think about the whole notion of scaling and how important it's been in my life. So all the way back to the White House in 2002, 2003, we tried maybe an idea in New Jersey, and then we wondered, will it scale to the rest of America? And then what was going on at Uber at the time? This was 2015, when the policymakers were telling me that my early childhood program won't scale. At Uber, around every corner, we were talking about scaling. And what I learned was scaling was largely an art. It was move fast and break things, or fake it till you make it, or throw spaghetti against a wall and whatever sticks, you cook it. That's art. Simply, plainly stated, that is using art to scale. So I started to wonder, can I add science to scaling? Just like we have science in every walk of life. We have science around innovation. We have science around how to curb inflation. We have science around what pills to take to cure various diseases. I inquired, why don't we have science around scaling? So I started to write academic papers. And I wrote a few dozen academic papers. But what I noticed was nobody was paying attention to my academic papers on scaling. Because, Mir, you and your listeners don't want to pick up an academic paper and try to figure out, right, what is the economies? What's this math? What are these Greek symbols? Nobody wants to read that stuff, right? So I made a decision at that point. I want to take out all of the economies. I want to take out all of the math. I want to take out all of the jargon. And I want to write a book that a truck driver can understand. And I say truck driver in an affectionate way because that's my grandpa, father, and brother. So I wrote the book, The Voltage Effect, which is a layperson's look into, if you have an idea, what is the science behind the promise of scaling that idea?
That is extremely interesting. You know, I haven't found many books like that, which is why I picked it up myself. And it's been such a phenomenal read and a interesting case study to educate yourself as you build and as you scale, whether it might be a podcast, a company, or you know, and to your point, your book, scaling doesn't just necessarily have to mean a business. You could be scaling in any part of your life, right? Even building your house, your family, whatever. There's scaling is a science, which I love that you are pioneering. Now, we can pick up the book, right? So where can you buy the book? On Amazon? Where's the most popular place to get it?
Oh, gosh. I think most people have been picking it up on Amazon, but as a chief economist at Walmart, I'd prefer if you did Walmart, but I just want people to look at it and read it and learn from it. So, yeah, it's on Amazon.com. It's in most bookstores, too. Okay. But, you know, I'm an indie bookstore guy. So if you can support your local bookstore, you know, I hope that you not only get out of it what are features of an idea that can scale, but also the back half of the book talks about 4 behavioral economic secrets that will help you execute. So the idea behind scaling is you not only need an idea that's scalable, but you also need to execute. And what I've learned for years is that simple economic rules that can really help you execute, people fail on. And I talk about those in the back half of the book. So I want you to think about the back half is 4 little behavioral economic secrets to make sure you execute at high voltage.
Amazing. And I don't want to give away those secrets because I read the book. It was so phenomenal for me. I'm rereading it again, and I look forward to people picking it up at Walmart in their local bookstore. But, to ask questions flirting with the idea without getting into the book, again, you're such an accomplished economist and award-winning, and you've done so much. How does a company scale? Because for the audience that might not realize what scaling means, scaling is going from 1 customer to 5, from 5 to 50. It's going from $1 million valuation to a 10 to 100 because to scale to a Netflix or an Apple, you don't do that overnight. What is the science of these companies that have scaled and become $100 billion, trillion-dollar companies?
Your question's a great one. This is just a wonderful question. And let me try to take it on in terms of how to think about, first of all, what are the signatures of an idea that at least has a chance to scale? One typical mistake that people make is they overestimate the size of the audience that they have. And what I mean by that is, what is a slice of pie that your idea can capture? And I talk about this in chapter 2. There are systematic ways that people use, like focus groups and surveys. They have inherent flaws, and people still use those techniques. You can use those techniques with a bit of you have to jigger it a bit, but you can get the truth more easily about what is the size of your audience. Now, another typical mistake that people make is they think that when they have a small success, that it will smoothly be enhanced or scaled, and they don't think about, were there unique inputs that I was using in the small that I won't have access to in the large? So the example I use in the book is it the chef or is it the ingredients? A lot of restaurants just kill it with one restaurant, and then they try to have 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 because they think, I had $1 million of EBITDA with one restaurant. If I have 10, I'm going to have $10 million of EBITDA, and maybe I'll have economies of scale too. So maybe I'll have $11 million of EBITDA. But they don't understand that if their initial success was because of a unique chef and they can't hire 10 unique chefs as they scale, they're dead. If the initial success was because of ingredients, and those ingredients can be had at scale, now as long as they execute, it will work. The general idea here is make sure that your unique inputs in the small are available in the large. A lot of times people overestimate whether they're going to be able to get those inputs in the large. And then kind of the third big reason is there are these spillovers. Every idea has a spillover. Think about Facebook. Facebook is a high voltage idea because when it was small and hardly anyone was on Facebook, it's not really very valuable for anyone. But as more and more of your friends become members of Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or whatever, there are what's called network externalities, and the service becomes more valuable to you as a user as more and more people take it on. So goods that have network externalities, when they scale, they have really high voltage because they become more and more valuable for the customers. That means that the person supplying these goods or services with network externalities, it scales much, much more easily. Plus, they can profit from it.
Lessons right there, which you're literally a masterclass mentor right now, relate back to even things you mentioned about '08, over leveraging, right? Just because you have $1 million EBITDA here, it's going to work across 10 different locations. Because that was going to be my follow-up question to that. What about the failures that we've seen of companies that had momentum? Because momentum is this idea of velocity and getting to a place of success. I look at even companies like Jawbone, which I believe had a first mover advantage in the fitness wearable space over the Apple Watch, over the Fitbits, but somehow they failed despite the funding. What happens to those ideas that have scaled but have not tipped the edge, Berg, and then failed. Like, where does that come into play?
Yeah. So part of it's execution. Part of it is just really poor execution. The other part is, think about McDonald's. So in chapter 2, I talk about the McDonald's CEO said, look, we're going to expand in the late 90s. We're going to create this burger called the Arch Deluxe. And what he did was he brought in a bunch of people to do focus groups, and they all told him, I'd buy the Arch Deluxe. If you put it out there, I'll buy it. And he said, will you buy it at $4.99? Yes. Will you buy it at $5.99? Yes. He overestimated the extent of market. He overestimated, as we all know, what's the potential market size. And we all have ways to estimate that. In many cases, people dupe themselves. In some cases, because of things like confirmation bias or herding. These are psychological biases that we all have. And if you fall prey to them, you then go down this long tunnel, and it's a tunnel to nowhere because it's an idea that never had a chance. And it never had a chance because the manner in which you did your investigation and you did your data collection was cooked, and you just duped yourself. So in a lot of cases, think about Blockbusters the same way. They had a shot, but they ended up making a wrong decision. Kodak was the same way. And a lot of this is adapting to change. Some of it is predicting what's going to happen in the future. But the other part is deciding that you're going to make the future yourself. You're going to do experimentation and figure out, is there a pocket of people that this will work for? And then if I do a slight product configuration, does it work for an even bigger pocket of people? And you constantly experiment and try new things and bring back what works. And you shutter what doesn't work. You constantly pivot around ideas. That's a winning recipe.
And that's what you mentioned at the start of the podcast, this idea of pivoting. And you've devoted your life work to experiments and using effectively the economy in a way as an experiment to make goods and services a better place for the consumers and the businesses so everyone can make money. Now, it's interesting because 100% I agree with you. And I just learned a lot from you about execution there, about why the statistic is so high for why most startups fail. You just literally nailed it there. And you can go more into that in the voltage effect when people pick that up. But what about, you mentioned Blockbuster failed through and Kodak. Now you look at companies like Facebook, because I'll use that example because you mentioned it. They recently changed their name to Meta. Now I'm sure they have, with the amount of cash they print, I'm sure they have people in play, economists, strategists that are forecasting and using analytics. And Facebook has a lot of data scientists. But when you look at the stock performance, and I know stock is not relative to direct value or performance of the company in the moment, TikTok took a lot of market share from Facebook. Yeah. Why does that happen in scaling, despite the fact that Facebook has already scaled, has proven their marketplace, has people in place to avoid that, but it still happened?
Yeah, sometimes there are shocks like, for example, Apple changing a configuration that does not allow you to monetize people in the same way that you monetized before. Facebook had, let's say, a system set up to where they could personalize advertisements, and that becomes very valuable and lucrative. That's what Google does. Google does it all in-house. Facebook was relying on Apple. And they were relying on a system that if somebody took it away, the ability to use data, in individual data, Apple said, look, privacy is important to us, so we're no longer going to play the game the way we used to. That really hurt Facebook. And Facebook was exposed in a way that they've never been exposed. So I think they've pivoted and said, look, we are going to create the metaverse, and we're going to create it in a way to where we own all of the elements in the chain, because before they didn't. And they didn't because it's clear that Apple did. And I won't get any deeper into that, but it was an exogenous shock that they're still trying to grapple with, because they're still trying to develop new algos and develop new approaches so they can monetize the ad space like they used to. They said, okay, in Meta, we have a shot to make our own world. And if we can set that up in a way that we're not relying on somebody else for information, we have a lot better shot in the long run. So I think it makes perfect sense. Now, is metaverse a good bet, or is something else a good bet? I don't have a crystal ball. I feel like it in the wake of what was happening to them, a pivot made a lot of sense. And then that was a particular pivot that they chose.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't even take into account the consideration of Apple removing them and how that affected, and now they're building their own OS and the metaverse.
Yeah.
It goes back to everything that you speak about. This is what makes economics so interesting and the marketplace, because there's so many things that go into it, and there's always outliers and things that you discount as either an investor or the owner. You're always going to discount something, whether you say it or not. So I appreciate that. Now, Professor, we're coming into the conclusion here, and we've been privileged to have you here for the last hour. You've done so much. You're teaching students. You're a chief officer at Walmart. What more do you want to do? Because you've already done so much. What does the next decade look like for you?
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, thank you for that compliment. I think first of all, we have to cement scaling and cement that, in the past, people viewed innovation and scaling is sort of the pearls before the swine. And that's an old biblical phrase that everyone paid attention to the innovation, but then the implementation, that's just swine. I want people to recognize that it's really the pearls before the jadeite. And it's the jadeite where we can make deep impacts, dense and poverty alleviation, climate, discrimination, gender diversity and inclusiveness, etc. This is going to come through the science of scaling. So I want to finish this chapter. After that, what I've been working on lately with my partner is we've been developing a technology that's a wearable technology that young kids can wear. And we want to put some machine learning and AI around it to figure out what are the best ways to grow a child's brain. So my wife is named Dana Suskind, and she's a cochlear implant surgeon, and she works on early childhood. She just published a book called Parent Nation, and before that, a book called 30 Million Words. So I'm really bullish on this technology because we think we can develop a means by which we can understand how and why the brain grows in certain ways at an early age. And we can use this technology to make the world a better place and give everybody a shot at starting at the same line. Because right now, I think the biggest disappointment I have in public education is not every child is given the same opportunity. And not every child's given the same opportunity because of what happens from 0 to 5. And we want to shore that up. We've been doing a fair amount of work from the delivery room to kindergarten. And we're really bullish on this technology to really help us learn what are the best ways to grow a child's brain.
Wow, that is amazing technology. We're going to have to bring you on as you launch that and see that journey. We're going to have to bring you back on to talk about that, because kudos to you and your wife. And that is the ultimate dream, being able to change lives. Just when I thought you couldn't do anything more, you do it again. So that
you are way too kind. Thanks so much for having me.
No, thank you so much. And Professor, I will post all the details to your books, everything, so people can go look at The Voltage Effect and the other books you read and your research online for those who want to look at academia. Any last takeaways you want to give the audience? A lot of these people just graduated back in May. What 10-second takeaway do you want to give them?
Absolutely. I want you to be monomaniacal. I want you to do things that you're good at doing. That's called comparative advantage. And I want you to wake up every morning convinced that you're going to change the world.
Wow, that is as powerful. That is the best way to end it. This is our mentor number 35, Dr. John List. Make sure to read his new book, The Voltage Effect. This was personally one of my favorite episodes because I learned so much as I was going through the process. Thank you, Doctor.
Thanks so much, Mir, and take care. Keep changing the world. I love what you're doing.